Hi, welcome.
Hi, Rachel. Hi, Sean. I actually am going to, how do I do that? Oh, here it is, security. I'm gonna let people just come in. I've disabled the waiting room. Yeah, that's what I wanted to do.
Sounds good. And then Patty, will you hit the record button on your side of the Zoom
good
screen?
for you. That's why I always start recording, let it start, and then I clip it. Because I forget then to turn it on. And my computer's doing a scan. Okay. So Jim is a new lecturer in film and media studies. He also
Hi, everyone.
Is a screenwriter. We're having a winter conference on the theme for the year is performing woman in quotation marks. And because we wanted to get at both gender issues, but also simply I'm speaking to Valerie. I also speak because I know you know. Also speaking to women who are performing male parts or crossing races in the performances that they adopt. So Jim's been working on the Hollow Crown, right? Turning it into a film from a series.
Yeah, I've been looking at how Ben Power did the adaptation for the BBC series, which is sort of a mixture of a collection of films and a TV series. Specifically, I'm looking at season 2 to see how the role of Queen Margaret's foregrounded through adaptive strategy. So yeah, really looking forward to it and very much appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, he'll be one of our keynote speakers, and Simone Chess, whom I think you know, don't you, Valerie? She'll be another.
Oh, that's cool.
So she's a former grad of my grad, in fact, my little grad. They've all grown up. But okay, so we probably should start and people will come. Oh, they're in. Why don't I see them though? Let me change my view.
If you hit participants, you should be able to see everybody.
There, I did, and I can. I hit gallery. And so we've got a nice group so far. Hi, Jim. You know Valerie, don't you? Okay. And Liv, we can't see you. Is that? No. It's the other Olivia. Bienvenue. We can't see you. I don't know whether that's intentional. Chris Maccabee. God. It's like I'm being haunted by my former graduate students. This is great. Okay, so we're really, really proud to have Valerie finally be able to speak to us. She was supposed to come out in person 2 years ago. And I asked Bernadette, who had invited her to come out as the Bliss Zimmerman lecturer, to introduce her. And Nicole's gonna run the PowerPoint and Valerie is gonna sweep us away with her brilliance. So Bernadette, could you please take it away?
Thank you so much. So I do want to say that I and all of us are extremely pleased and honored to have Valerie here. And I'm especially honored to be able to introduce Valerie Traub, who is the Adrienne Rich Distinguished University Professor of English and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Michigan. She is the author of 3 groundbreaking and widely influential books: Thinking Sex with the Early Moderns, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2015, The Renaissance of Lesbianism in Early Modern England, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2002, and Desire and Anxiety, Circulations of Sexuality in Shakespearean Drama, published by Routledge in 1992 and reissued in 2014. And on a personal note, I recall when Desire and Anxiety was first published, with my dissertation director rushing into our graduate seminar with a copy in hand and overbrimming with excitement. I can say that I have felt the same way about every book Valerie has published, as have the countless students and scholars who have been profoundly impacted by her work. We are eagerly awaiting her fourth monograph, Mapping Normality in the Early Modern West, which examines how gender, race, and sexuality in cartographic and anatomical illustration comprise a prehistory of the concept of the normal. She has also edited several important collections, including the Oxford Handbook of Shakespeare and Embodiment, which received the 2016 Ronald H. Baton Prize from the 16th Century Society. This editing work underscores her commitment to fostering innovative research and collaborative dialogues across early modern studies, queer studies, feminist studies, and critical race studies, and is a testament to her mentorship of new and diverse voices. Her deep engagement with these fields is also signaled by her years of service as chair of the Women's Studies Department at the University of Michigan, most recently in 2020. With all of these accolades, she epitomizes the scholarly, political, and ethical values of the namesake of the endowed chair she holds, the writer and activist Adrienne Rich, whose declared aim was to quote, "the creation of a society without domination." Again, we are honored to have Valerie Traub share her most recent research with us in her paper for today, The Blush, Racializing Sexuality Through Early Modern Ovid. And we look forward to our conversation with her after her talk.
Thanks so much, Bernadette, for that really lovely introduction. And thanks to all of you for such a warm welcome. I'm really delighted to be back at UCSB, even if I'm not with you physically. You missed the opportunity to experience your conviviality, which I've loved in the past, as well as the walk on the beach. I'm a native Californian, Southern Californian actually, so I really wish I could be with you in person. I want to thank Nicole, especially for all of her help in organizing this event, and especially Nicole for your assistance with the PowerPoint, because I'm not that great with all this technological stuff. It makes me nervous. I do feel the need to apologize a bit for the quality of my PowerPoint slides. This is about as good as it gets. I'm only using them to help you access early modern quotations and also access some of my bibliographic references. I'm pretty committed to showing my work and try to help you see the people that I am engaging with. But I didn't go to a lot of effort to make them interesting, I'm afraid. We're also at the end of the semester here, and I have a lot of graduate students doing prelims and things like that. So anyway, to begin. The Blush, Racializing Sexuality Through Early Modern Ovid. Blushing is simultaneously an embodied and affective capacity. As an involuntary bodily response, the act of blushing can indicate a range of affects: erotic desire, emotional longing, envy, shame, fear, and even anger. But the blush has a history, and its meanings change across time. In the medieval and early modern periods, blushing is associated with fairness, paleness, and pallor. And over the course of early modernity, blushing is increasingly denied to those with dark skin. My talk today explores the ramifications of this association and denial. It derives from a collaboration I've been involved in with my colleague and friend, Peggy McCracken, over the past several years. After a symposium I organized at the Institute for the Humanities, we co-edited a volume on the Ovidian tale of Iphis and Ianthe, called Ovidian Transversions, which explores how the translation and adaptation of this tale of sex change from Ovid's Latin Metamorphoses contribute to medieval and early modern understandings of gender and sexuality. We had so much fun with this collection that we decided to co-teach a graduate seminar together that would extend our engagement with other Ovidian tales from the Metamorphoses 15 books, as they were translated or adapted in French and English literature, visual art, and music. We have just finished writing 2 essays that evolved out of our conversations with a group of wonderful students last winter, as we made our way through 12 tales and their afterlives and repurposings. Although the thinking that went into our essays was very much a collective effort, these essays are not co-written in the conventional sense of each of us having a compositional hand in both. Rather, for separate but argumentatively linked essays, we focused on different periods, languages, and texts, while regularly responding to each other's outlines and drafts. This was the easiest essay I've ever written, and certainly the most fun I've ever had writing one. And as this is the first time I've given it as a talk, I'm especially eager to hear your responses. Peggy's work on French medieval literature has increasingly focused on issues of posthumanism. In part 1 of our linked work, she argues that the act of blushing in Ovidian contexts sutures whiteness, human expressivity, relationality, and life itself. My talk today builds on the conceptual link she establishes between race, affect, and relationality to argue that the blush becomes further implicated in the conferral and denial of human status in early modernity, precisely because it racializes sexuality while also sexualizing racial difference. My argument, in short, is that by the late 16th century, the blush becomes a point of convergence for a racialized sexuality, whereby an affectively self-reflexive subject of erotic desire is constructed as generically, in its very essence, white. In particular, the capacity to express, by means of blushing, the complexity and ambivalence of one's desiring state becomes a defining feature of white erotic subjectivity. Now, that is a pretty compact and complex set of assertions, and the rest of my talk will be dedicated to explaining what I mean. But first, let me provide you with a bit of context and directional signposting. First, this talk is part of a growing push on the part of early modernists to analyze how whiteness fits into discourses of race in the early modern period. And I want to register my debt to early modernists working in critical race studies listed on these 2 slides. I have a special debt to the recent work of Arthur Little, Jr., whose notion of whiteness as a cultural assemblage undergirds my approach. At stake in my argument is that the racialization of whiteness depends not only on ideas about the supposed capabilities of what early moderns called humoral complexion, but also on the link between complexion and specific affective capacities that come to epitomize human interiority, desiring subjectivity, and sociality. Also at stake, and taking my cue from the Metamorphoses' own emphasis on becoming over being, is an effort to engage the concept of race as an ongoing cultural project of race-making rather than a pre-given ontological set of stable categories. Second, I want to indicate some of the key concepts that I will be leveraging while making this argument. They include capacity and being in relation, complexity, perplexity, and ambivalence, temporality and affect, experience and inexperience, and knowledge and non-knowledge. For those of you who have looked at my last book, Thinking Sex with the Early Moderns, you may hear some familiar themes regarding the production of sexual knowledge. Third, it may also be helpful to know that for the past year, I have been the principal investigator for an interdisciplinary research team at the University of Michigan focused on the topic of ambivalence, where we are exploring its utility as an affective capacity for negotiating political issues, both in the past and in the present. And last, This talk is part of my larger interest in arguing for the constitutive import of transversions of Ovid in early modern culture. Here, I will be exploring how translations of the Metamorphoses, the genre of Ovidian-inspired epilia, and what I submit is its pornographic progeny, work together to fuse race with sexuality. So that's my preamble. This talk has 6 parts and should clock in about 45 minutes, at about 45 minutes total. So part 1, analyzing the social dimensions of the blush. Early modern literary critics have typically read the involuntary reddening of the face as a relatively straightforward signifier that reveals the spontaneous articulation of some internal truth. Blushing is simultaneously the natural expression of an internal affective experience, the feeling of blood rushing to one's face, and an external sign that needs to be read. It solicits acts of interpretation on the part of both blusher and viewer. Indeed, both within textual diegesis and critical analysis, the blush requires interpretation. Such hermeneutic acts typically attempt to pin down the meaning of a given blush, even if ambivalent meanings often persist. In early modern texts, whereas blushing retains its prior Christian associations with sin, guilt, and contrition, and sometimes indicates fear or anger, it is most pervasively deployed in erotic contexts. And here, it can paradoxically function as a signifier of fleshly desire and experience, as well as their negation or denial. Indeed, because the blush can simultaneously signify both of these opposed states, and because it reveals something that the subject may wish to conceal, the blush is not only hermeneutically, but structurally ambivalent. In early modern texts, this ambivalence is often gendered. Because blushing is frequently deployed or read as a contradictory sign of female desire and female chastity, it raises the prospect of women's ever-present capacity to seem to be something other than what they are, thus condensing within itself the misogynist topos of women's essential intrinsic capacity for duplicity. It often produces, particularly in early modern drama, a performative or epistemological crux that thematizes and enacts a problem of gendered or sexual knowledge. Blushing is also linked to a racialized discourse of duplicity in early modern texts that specifically disallow it to Black people. Aaron, in Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, articulates the period sense of the impossibility of a blush suffusing dark skin. Responding to Chiron's fear of his Goth mother's shame in bearing a Black child, quote, "I blush to think upon this ignominy," the Black Aaron replies, "Why, there's the privilege your beauty bears. Fie, treacherous hue, that will betray with blushing the close enacts and counsels of thy heart." In Aaron's complicated, ironizing reversal of racist thought, white is a treacherous hue, whereas Black, already condemned for its supposedly intrinsic duplicity, cannot betray itself. Even when construed as a mode of compulsive honesty and self-betrayal, then, blushing here is essentialized as a constitutive feature of whiteness. One of the principal ways in which whiteness was racialized in the early modern period is through the trope of fairness. Part of a broader discourse on beauty and nobility present in classical and medieval and Petrarchan literature, fairness is racialized not only when it is diacritically opposed to darkness, as is implied in Aaron's speech, but through encomiums to fair beauty that hyperbolize the value of white skin. Whereas critical efforts to expose such hierarchies of value have productively revealed the extent of racialization in early modern culture, they often follow Aaron's cue in apprehending whiteness and Blackness as stable, self-evident categories of being. The result is that blushing tends to be viewed less as an ongoing process of race-making than as a physiological state that is preemptively denied to Black subjects. I argue, in contrast, that the racialization of blushing depends not on any essential feature of Blackness, but on the epistemological incapacity of the viewer to discern blushing in those with dark complexions. By shifting the question from the ontological capacity of the subject to the epistemological incapacity of the viewer to perceive corporeal signs, we can approach blushing as a bodily and relational mark that is always in the process of being racialized by human actors and actions. This processual focus, which renders the black-white binary less ontological and more historical, can be further adduced by inserting the dynamics of affect and temporality into analyses of fair beauty. I am anticipated in this move by Carolyn Dinshaw, whose analysis of medieval paleness views pallor as an alteration of an affective state, manifest through a temporal dimension. In her analysis, one becomes pale because of a disequilibrium in one's typical bodily condition, or, as pre-moderns would have it, one's complexion. Paleness is thus relational, and not just relative to darkness, but also relative to a former whiteness. Quote, paleness isn't a term that connotes a pure or whole essential state of being. It implicates some previous time or some other thing. Just as paleness is affectively and temporally relative, so too is blushing. In temporal terms, the blush is an occasional and transitory mark, constructed by whites, that calls attention to, but does not override, more habitual coloration or perdurable markers. Further, the blush is affectively relational, implicating both the viewer and the viewed in acts of looking, interpreting, and knowing. Insofar as the Middle English blishen means to shine brightly, to blush red, and to gaze upon, Valerie Allen, for instance, extrapolates that to blush means to know, to see, an etymology that makes sense of the still extant, temporally inflected knowledge phrase, at first blush. Allen's gesture towards blushing as not only a mode of being in relation, but being in a knowledge relation that is cross-cut by affect and temporality, resonates with my effort to bring blushing to bear on the diacritics of race, and to read the effects of that pressure on a particular relation, that of sexual desire. By reading blushing in those early modern texts explicitly invested in detailing erotic experience and the acquisition of erotic knowledge, we can better see how the dynamics of temporality and affect cohere in the processes of racialization. The flush of redness suffusing the skin registers an intensity of emotional response, particularly as concerns sexuality, at its most conflicted, self-contradictory, and self-reflexive. When it comes to the relationship of desire to knowledge, blushing is not only a sign of ambivalence, it is itself a deeply ambivalent sign. Neither desire nor shame, but both, neither innocence nor experience, but their coincidence. Part 2. Early modern transversions of Ovid help us to see how the discourse of blushing is explicitly racialized and sexualized as a matter of knowledge relations. As Teresa Cryer notes, blushes derived from Sappho, Homer, Virgil, and particularly Ovid are found everywhere in Renaissance romance, drama, lyric, and epilia. They are also found in translations of Ovid's Metamorphoses, most especially those of Arthur Golding, written in 14er lines and published in 1567, and George Sandys, published in 1632, which includes not only his translations of the stories composed in heroic couplets, but prose commentary on them. In this section and the following two, I track the blush in two Ovidian transversions, the tales of Pygmalion and his ivory statue, and of the water nymph Salmacis and the youth Hermaphroditus. As narrated in Ovid, the sculptor Pygmalion, convinced of women's intrinsic wickedness, lived a celibate life while carving a life-size woman of snow-white ivory, to him more beautiful than any woman ever born. Quote, fired with love and desire for the body he had formed, he brings the statue gifts of flowers, clothes, shells, and jewels, touching her everywhere while whispering words of love. It's an incredibly creepy story. During the festival of Venus, he prays for a living likeness of her, a wish that is fulfilled when he lays down with her, kisses her, and touches her breasts, and finds her ivory hardness growing soft, quote, yielding to his hands. The snow-white ivory out of which the statue is carved is a point of Ovidian overemphasis, via first the sculptor's rhetorical question, is it flesh or ivory? Not ivory, still, he's sure. Then his prayer to Venus to grant the sculpture life. He dared not say my ivory girl, rather the living likeness of my ivory girl, as well as the fear expressed during his caresses that the statue's limbs might darken with a bruise. The blush in this story occurs at the culmination of the statue's metamorphosis to living woman. Her blush is not merely a response to another's desire, but, as Peggy McCracken argues in her essay, an indication of life itself. Quote, his lips pressed real lips, and she, his girl, felt every kiss and blushed, and shyly raised her eyes to his and saw the world and him. The statue's blush articulates the wondrous experience of first sight, a trope that classical texts frequently associate with knowledge acquisition. And, as is often the case with Ovid, their subsequent sexual union is referenced only long after the fact and only implicitly, as we retrospectively learn of the birth of an infant girl. Sex, then, in Ovid's original tale, is retroactively imported back into the narrative in a way that is consistent with its disinterest in sexual shame, which, it turns out, is precisely the affect that medieval and early modern writers will choose to highlight when they translate and repurpose this tale. George Sandy's early 17th century commentary, a feature appended after his translation of each Ovidian book, offers a lengthy explanation of various aspects of the tale that is framed by what he calls historical stories. The first speculates biographically about the sculptor's object of desire. Quote, but taken historically, this statue may be some virgin on whom Pygmalion was enamored, who, long as obdurate as the matter whereof she was made, was mollified at length by his obsequiousness, the ivory expressing the beauty of her body, and her blushes the modesty of her mind. Ivory becomes a metaphor for the beauty of bodily integrity, while blushes express the modesty that informed that integrity. Sandy's second story relates a report by Pliny and Lucan about, quote, a youth of no ignoble family, his name suppressed for foulness of the fact, who grew so desperately enamored of that celebrated statue of naked Venus, carved in Parian marble by Praxiteles, that he finally ran to the statue, embraced it strictly in his arms, warming the cold marble with his burning kisses, and so contaminated it with his lust, that the stains ever after remained as a monument of his impiety. By means of this anecdote, Sandys imports into the tale not only furtive sex, but sex that is monumentally preserved, figured as semen's permanent stain on pure white, semi-translucent marble. In the midst of these explanatory historical accounts, Sandys offers an exegesis of the statue's blush that complicates his prior reading. Quote, blushing is a resort of the blood to the face, which, in the passion of shame, labors most in that part, and is seen in the breast as it ascendeth, but most apparent in those that are young, in regard of their greater heat and tender complexions, which proceeds not from an infirmity of the mind, but the novelty of the thing, nor can be either put on or restrained, the ensign of native modesty and the color of virtue. Here the blush indicates both shame and virtue, as we might expect. But Sandys also describes blushing as a function of age, which itself is associated with both a tender complexion and some kind of inexperience or incipient knowledge, that is, the novelty of the thing. Given that Sandys ends with a definition of the blush that links native modesty to the color of virtue, I propose that it is in such circumlocutions that we begin to see concepts of sexual experience and inexperience, sexual knowledge and non-knowledge, and racialization as related to both nativity and skin color converge. Part 3. Perhaps taking his cue for copia from Golding, Francis Beaumont expands the tale to almost 1,000 lines of iambic pentameter couplets that, oh, I'm sorry, I got rid of a page. Back to part 3. Okay. The genre of English epilia, little epics often dedicated to exploiting the erotic plots and themes of Ovid's Metamorphoses, make especially evident how sexuality is sutured to race via the blush. Among several epilia that highlight blushing and whiteness, Francis Beaumont's Salmacis and Hermaphroditus, published in 1602, an etiological story of thwarted desire and enforced union, is notable for how insistently the ambivalence of the blush is racialized. In Ovid's tale, Salmacis, a rather self-infatuated water nymph who spends most of her time happily observing and cultivating her own beauty, falls desperately in love with a 15-year-old stranger, Hermaphroditus, the son of Hermes and Aphrodite. After Salmacis attempts to seduce him with her immodest speech, Hermaphroditus blushes. Quote, "A rosy blush dyed the boy's cheeks. He knew not what love was, but blushes well became him, like the bloom of rosy apples hanging in the sun, or painted ivory, or when the moon glows red beneath her pallor, and the gongs resound in vain to rescue her eclipse." Temporarily fending her off, the youth swims naked in Salmacis's pool, unaware that she is hiding and gazing spellbound at his naked beauty. Overcome with desire, Salmacis strips off her clothing, dives into her pool, and grapples with him, entwining him like a snake, and vowing that he shall not escape, and praying that, ye gods ordain, no day shall ever dawn to part us twain. The gods assent and merge two bodies into one. Quote, "They two were two no more, nor man nor woman. One body then that neither seemed, and both." Hermaphroditus' blush is his body's betrayal of something he can't quite conceive. He knew not what love was. When Arthur Golding takes up this theme, by means of his 14er lines, he expands and intensifies the youth's lack of sexual knowledge, reveling in the viewer's pleasure in witnessing tonal variations of red and white. Quote, "And therewithal the boy waxed red. He wist not what love was, and sure it was a joy to see it, how exceeding well his blushing him became. For in his face the colour fresh appeared like the same that is in apples which do hang upon the sunny side, or ivory shadowed with a red, or such as is espied of white and scarlet colours mixing appearing in the moon, when folk in vain with sounding brass would ease unto her doom." Perhaps taking his cue for copia from Golding, Francis Beaumont expands the tale to almost 1,000 lines of iambic pentameter couplets that, in the words of Teresa Cryer, pursue a diffuse and not particularly urgent sexuality. Despite his updating and insertion of numerous mythological episodes, Jove, Phoebus, Diana, Venus, Vulcan, Bacchus, Mercury, and even Queen Elizabeth as Astrea all make appearances, Beaumont is faithful to the Metamorphoses in one respect. Among the profusions of reddenings, Hermaphroditus' blush is one of innocence abashed and made awkward, innocence the more poignant for being on the verge of sexual experience, which in Ovid's poem is generally equivalent to loss. While Prior's emphasis on Hermaphroditus' blush after Salmacis's seductive hailing stresses how Salmacis is aroused by it, my interest is in Beaumont's pun on becoming. At her loose speech, Hermaphroditus blushed. He knew not what love was, yet love did shame him, making him blush, and yet his blush became him. Not only is blushing as nascent knowledge tethered to shame, but by means of this pun, Hermaphroditus becomes his blush. As his erotic subjectivity is rendered synonymous with, identified and expressed by his flush of red blood, erotic subject and confused affect become one. Since Hermaphroditus proleptically gives his name to the male-female that is the result of Salmacis's unrelenting desire and his equally strong resistance, it is altogether fitting that this figure of gender ambivalence is figured at its inception by that which is structurally ambivalent, a blush. Part 4. 4 forms of analytic leverage emerge from these transversions of Ovid's Pygmalion and Salmacis and Hermaphroditus. First, the blush is temporally inflected, not only in terms of its own ephemerality, but in its relationship to erotic desire and sexual knowledge. Critics typically bifurcate the ambivalence of the blush into a temporal arc of before and after, wherein the blush supposedly registers either the beforehand of sexual knowledge and experience, coded as innocence and chastity, or the aftermath of sexual knowledge and experience, coded as guilt and shame. I want to suggest that this either-or temporality is, in the transversional world of early modern Ovid, more often a both-and. Indeed, the blush reroutes the temporal and oftentimes teleological logic of sexuality, enacting a dynamic and confused simultaneity of knowledge and non-knowledge. Relatedly, this temporal simultaneity organizes a particular kind of affective experience in which sexual knowledge and non-knowledge and affective perplexity converge. The entwining of affect to knowledge relations becomes identified with a specific erotic subjectivity, one that is, above all else, ambivalent. That ambivalence may be phenomenologically experienced as a relation to erotic desire, for example, having conflicted desires, or it may be used ontologically to figure the terms of hermaphroditic embodiment, that is, 2 bodies merged into one. But ambivalence is the hallmark of this erotic subjectivity. Third, this erotic subjectivity is increasingly racialized. As the blush is not only a feature of erotic allure and resistance, innocence and guilt, and youthful inexperience and experience, but an emphatic feature of the erotic subject's fairness. In Ovid's version, Hermaphroditus' neck is described, like Pygmalion's statue, as ivory, and when he dives into Salmacis' pool, his body is likened to, quote, white lilies or a figure of ivory. Golding's transversion retains the reference to Hermaphroditus' ivory neck while dilating on the voyeuristic scene of his swim. Rowing with his hands and legs, he swims in the water clear, through which his body fair and white doth glisteringly appear, as if a man an ivory image or a lily white should overlay or close with glass that were most pure and bright. Perhaps underscoring the necessity of racial sameness for the soon-to-be merged pair, Golding also adds a reference to Salmacis' fairness that is not in the original. Beaumont's insistent amplification of whiteness is so hyperbolic that it is worth quoting in full. Referring 14 times to the gleaming whiteness of the fair boy and fair stranger, the poem presents him not only as far fairer than the god of love, but so wondrous fair he was that all of Diana's nymphs are blinded by his face. He not only possesses ivory skin and a white side, but skin whiter than mountain snow hath ever been, and a white hand that is whiter than the driven snow. As he leaps naked into the pool, like ivory then his snowy body was, or a white lily in a crystal glass. Even Phoebus, the sun god, who so doted on his roseate face, is beset with fears of spoiling that same ivory skin whose whiteness he so much delighted in. As this contrast of red and white suggests, though youth's whiteness is offset by his roseate cheek and the redness of his lip, in similes that reiterate the topos of blushing. His cheek was sanguine, and his lip as red as are the blushing leaves of the rose spread. Albeit in less hyperbolic terms, Salmacis is also repeatedly described as fair and white. Fair Salmacis, so lovely fair, a fair nymph, the fair water nymph, fairer than fairest, so fair she was, with so fair a cheek. Her teeth are whiter than the morning's milk. She has a white hand, a snowy hand, ivory arms, snowy limbs, and a snow-white knee. She even describes herself as fairer than love's queen. Together, Hermaphroditus and Salmacis don't merely a hermaphrodite make, they make a decidedly white one. And yet, despite the insistence of Beaumont's poem on the desiring subject's whiteness, the extent to which this whiteness signifies an essential trait is not, in ontological terms, particularly stable. And this is perhaps where the deontological logic of metamorphosis is most germane to my analytic of historicizing racism. In Ovid, the moment when Hermaphroditus comes to embody his name is rendered as a merging, blending, grafting, joining, and knitting together of bodies, form, face, and limbs. Quote, both bodies merged in one, both blended in one form and face, as when a gardener sets a graft and sees, growth seal the join, and both mature together. Thus, when in fast embrace their limbs were knit, they were two no more, nor man nor woman, one body then that neither seemed, and both. When Beaumont narrates this transformation, he further materializes their embodied union by means of their blood, which commingles and changes temperature. Quote, and in one body they began to grow. She felt his youthful blood in every vein, and he felt hers warm his cold breast again. This thermodynamics of blood had been anticipated by their initial touch. In her moist palm she locked his white hand fast, then in her hand his wrist she 'gan to close, when through his pulses straight the warm blood glows, whose youthful music fanning Cupid's fire, in her warm breast kindled a fresh desire. Then did she lift her hand unto his breast, a part as white and youthful as the rest. Given this cross-body communication of heat and blood, Salmacis's protestation to the struggling Hermaphroditus, quote, thy cheek is never fair when none is by, for what is white and red but to the eye, de-essentializes fairness as well as blushing. If fairness and blushing are only evident when another's eye bears witness to them, then they manifest above all, being in relation, and are dependent not only for their meaning, but their existence on profoundly social interactions. Part 5. The use of the blush in early modern English pornography picks up and extends the tropes of Ovidian-influenced English epilia. These later, more sexually explicit texts, known for their self-promotion as erotic pedagogy, appropriate and elaborate the nexus of temporality, affect, knowledge, and race I've been tracing thus far. A dialogue between a married lady and a maid, published around 1684, is itself a transversion of Nicholas Coyer's Satira Sotatica de Arcanis Amoris et Veneris, published in 1660. The later described by James Turner as the most important erotic text of the 17th century. Massively abridged and domesticated to accord with the values of companionate marriage, a dialogue is a back and forth exchange of sex talk and sex acts, principally narrated by and often conducted between Octavia, a maid about to be wed, and Tullia, her older married cousin. While describing their first sexual experiences with their husbands, both women refer to blushing in ways that implicate it in terms that link confused or perplexed affect, sexual knowledge, and temporality. Says Tullia of her husband's actions as he proceeds from touching, kissing, and sucking her, quote, white, round, and firm breasts. Quote, but this time I felt something through his shirt, very pressing against my thigh, which when, by my blushing, he found I had perceived, he threw off the cloths, and taking up his own linen, showed me a long, stiff-headed prick. His skin and shape were admirable, the one being clean and well-proportioned, the other white as snow, and only here and there upon the breast and belly, shaded with some light brown hair. I turned away my eyes, being all covered with red. Blushing here signifies Tullia's modesty, embarrassment, desire, and possibly fear of sex. But despite her averted eyes and her confusion, she shares with her husband some kind of recognition of what his long, stiff-headed prick means for her future. Unsurprising for a text intent on soliciting readerly pleasure, no reference to a blush-filled, guilt-ridden afterward appears in either woman's narrative. Instead of following a temporal arc, the moment of the blush appears in the midst of sexual activity. When asked by Octavia if she was silent during the lovemaking that Tullia has just described in patient detail, Tullia responds, my sighs and blushes were all the interruptions I gave him, longing, I must confess, as much to see what become of his endeavors as he could to perform them. At this moment, blushing signifies Tullia's own pleasure, her own desires, her own ambivalent way of interrupting actions that she actually wants to continue. In short, blushing becomes a feature constitutive of sex itself. When Octavia describes her own wedding night, a blush follows immediately after her first unanticipated orgasm, leading to a confused simultaneity of contradictory emotions. Quote, he made me spend so pleasantly such a quantity of the delicious nectar that it flew about his hand and all wetted him. I beg thy pardon, my lovely Octavia, said he, for not expecting thy pleasure, for nature in us men is something so eager that we cannot withstand its first impetuosities. I was struck with a mighty confusion at my own lust, and blushing and hiding my face, I said that if he felt any moisture, it was that which he had put into me, and not any that I had sent out. Octavia's blush here signifies embarrassment and a mighty confusion at her own lust, mingled with delight in her body's ability to spend or orgasm so pleasantly, a delight that maidenly modesty requires she deny. In Tullia's earlier description of her sexual encounter, the attribute of whiteness characterizes not only her breasts, but her husband's skin, in a pornographic appropriation of racialized discourses of fair beauty. But the text is even more invested in whiteness than in generously including male genitals within its orbit of attractiveness. Tullia's husband plays gently with her light brown pubic hair, admiring, quote, the pretty effects of its shade upon a white skin. And when Octavia asks her own husband to describe his ideal woman, the text doubles down on this investment by presenting a panegyric to whiteness. After acknowledging that men variously desire fair, brown, black, and red-haired women, Philander's blazon to perfection of women's beauty includes no less than 6 allusions to whiteness. Her skin ought to be white and smooth, her arms turned as if they were of ivory, her thighs plump, white, and lessening by degrees, her foot ought to be white, plump, and little, her buttocks ought to be round, firm, and white, and finally, she must also have white teeth. One might have thought that having mentioned white skin, the preference would be clear. But whiteness here is offered as an aphrodisiac, serving to link, unify, and make enticingly coherent the separate body parts of this pornographic blazon. Combined with the text representations of blushing, this excessive investment in whiteness as aphrodisiac marks avid heterosexual desire as an implicitly and thoroughly racialized phenomenon. Regardless of whether the desires it signifies are licit or illicit, acknowledged or denied, experienced or narrated, blushing functions as a racialized marker of erotic subjectivity for young women and men alike. Final section. If the blush functions as a metonymy of the blood, conveying the attributes of vitality and aliveness, in corporeal terms, there is no ontological reason to deny it to those with dark skin. Within the psychophysiology of early modern humoralism, the flush of blood to the face was understood as the body's attempt to protect it from vulnerability. This thermal hydraulics always sought relative balance and homeostasis, and it was understood to be common to all humans, whatever their complexion and temperament. While Black people were thought to be cooler and drier, and thus more melancholic than whites, the fluctuation of the blood through heat and movement were nonetheless considered a shared feature of all races. But racism is radically opportunistic and often strategic in its inconsistency. Notwithstanding the universality of waxing and waning blood to and from the face, the capacity to blush was increasingly discursively denied to those with dark skin. This denial was infamously expressed by Thomas Jefferson, who posed the rhetorical question, "Are not the fine mixtures of red and white, the expressions of every passion by greater or less suffusions of color in the one race, preferable to that eternal monotony which reigns in the countenances, that immovable veil of black which covers all the emotions of the other race?" In opposing the fine mixtures of red and white that express every passion to the immovable veil of black that hides all emotions, Jefferson collates human inexpressibility, implacability, and capacity for deceit in a politics of unknowing, presented as if of neutral observation about the, quote, other race. Jefferson's denial of Black expressivity extends to their sexual lives. Black men, quote, are more ardent after their female, but love seems with them to be more an eager desire than a tender, delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation. A delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation is precisely what is expressed by whites and on behalf of whites in the blush. Jefferson's political refusal of Black expressivity by means of these terms is thus heir to the racist assemblage I have been tracing. I claimed at the onset of this talk that the blush not only racializes sexuality, but sexualizes racial difference. At stake in both sides of this formulation is the capacity to experience sexual desire as a phenomenon of emotional and epistemological complexity, whether it be that of sexual knowledge, of ambivalence, of desire mixed with shame, of not knowing how to have sex, of not knowing what one wants. Cryer argues that, quote, the colors of love in European literature, red and white, reside in the arousing alternatives of innocence and experience, candor and shame, the quotidian complexion of white, broken by the rising blood of erotic self-consciousness. To this I would add that in denying that Black early moderns had the capacity to blush, white early moderns refused to imagine Black subjects' capacity to partake of a temporal experience of coming to erotic self-consciousness. Such self-consciousness entails not just consciousness of one's own desire, but consciousness of that desire as the being in relation, with that relationality cross-cut by multiple affects that are themselves subject to a society's interpretive codes. We can turn off the PowerPoint now. Thanks. Following the blush through Ovidian-inspired texts shows that the capacity to reflexively express the complexity of one's desiring state within specific conventions of erotic sociality becomes a defining feature of white subjectivity. Correlatively, in imputing to Black early moderns an inability to blush, white early moderns conveyed their own inability to imagine Black sexuality in the following ways: as erotic innocence or nascent erotic feeling in the process of gathering in new sensations, experiences, and knowledge, as a confused simultaneity of erotic sentiment and sensation, candor and shame, and as an expression of avid desire interlaced with ambivalence and perplexity. In short, they register their own incapacity to countenance some of the ways that Black subjects might navigate and reflexively express the intricacies of sexuality as a mode of human interaction. Of course, Black early moderns experienced, on a phenomenological level, all of these things, and no doubt they circumvented and exceeded the terms of this discourse in their erotic lives. But if, as Sharon Patricia Holland argues, there is an erotic life of racism, this erotic life takes on a particular tint in the early modern period, the blush. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful, wonderful and thought-provoking talk, Valerie. It triggers so many questions for me, but I'm sure for other people as well. And so I'm going to defer to them first before jumping in as usual and being the first person to ask a question. And so I open the floor to the audience. I take it you're willing to accept questions. Oh gosh, it was really lovely. I'm intrigued by what questions people will ask. So the floor is open.
Since it seems like I think everybody is on the screen, there's 16 participants.
Yeah.
So if people just want to speak out, that would be great. We don't have to use the chat.
Yeah, you don't need to put it in order. Just everybody could unmute and just talk. Oh, Bernadette's got a hand up. This is my problem, especially with the pale hand. The pale hand, talking about whiteness.
Yeah.
And my oddly black letter broadside ballad, it disappears into the ballad. So Bernadette.
Yeah, and I'll just mention practically, if we're all off mute, sometimes there can be feedback. So just if that happens, we'll have to mute. Yeah, thank you so much for that really incredible talk. And I guess my question is it's specific, but I think it also addresses the larger, your larger assertion about the importance of thinking about epistemology, and not being not just assuming ontological categories, and thinking through epistemology allows us to think historically, if I'm taking that. And I guess I've done work on Sandys, but really not on his Ovid. I've done work on Sandys as a traveler and as a colonial administrator. And so my question has to do, you're looking at the poles of whiteness and blackness, and which is a binary opposition, and it is a binary opposition that's really emerging, and it's becoming reified in the period. But because Sandys traveled through the Ottoman Empire and he was a colonial administrator in Virginia, where you have sort of a liminality of racial epistemologies that really are linked to empire, and the variant positionalities of the English in relation to empire, whether as supplicants in the Ottoman Empire or whether in the early Virginia colony, engaging in some, they're not seen as interracial marriages, but as encounters, as rethinking race in a very liminal way. It hardens later in the Virginia colonies. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit to what it would mean to do the sort of reading you're doing, starting with Sandy's Ovid in relation to maybe his other works that relate to the Ottoman Empire and then the incipient British Empire in the Americas.
That is such a great question, Bernadette. And you're absolutely right on so many counts, both in terms of placing Sandy's within his larger work of empire building and his encounters with various peoples around the globe, and the differential relationships of Western colonists to the different cultures that they encountered, both, as you said, as supplicants and dependents sometimes, and as those who would seek to dominate at other times. So I totally take that point. I haven't done that work, so I think now I will. I confess I have never slogged through Sandy's entire travel narrative, but this gives me a great motive for doing that. He did write the latter books of his translation of the Metamorphosis while being the colonial administrator of the Virginia colony. So the two are completely intermeshed. Interestingly, when Peggy and I co-taught our course, we were trying to think about that. Sandy's only talks about Native Americans once in the books, the 12 tales that we read. We didn't read the entire Metamorphoses. So that also is like a note to myself to go back and see where else. In fact, I think that may be in the entire book. He only refers to Native Americans once. Because which is an interesting distancing from his own personal engagement with people who he no doubt felt were both in some ways like him and unlike him, because that was the typical experience of the colonists. But your larger point, or your more theoretical point, is that I'm working with a binary too. And I'm using blushing to think through a binary, is one that actually hadn't occurred to me. So thank you very, very, very much. I need to think about that. I need to think about whether that is a challenge to what I'm doing.
I think the binary is emerging in Kim Hall says it, and then others elaborate, but it is emerging in terms of early modern English race making at precisely this moment. So I think it's important to examine the binary historically as you're doing it through epistemologies of race, sex, gender making. But it'd be interesting to maybe then think maybe as a companion project about some of the liminal spaces. And I was just going to quickly say it'd be useful to look at Sandy's his letters as a colonial administrator. I have not really done this, and his other letters, to just see where Ovidian allusions emerge in that corpus and to see how that might relate to questions of race and sexuality.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, and I will do that. Yeah, Sandy's go-to method in his commentary is to go back historically, as far back as he can. I think it's a kind of legitimating strategy for him as an author. He calls other writers more than he uses his own experience in his commentary. But seeing what he says elsewhere, I think, would be really, really helpful. I will just also say that the other project that I've been working on normality, is very much thinking about race and gender and sexuality in terms of what I call degrees of difference and a non-binary framework because of the archive that I'm looking at, which is anatomical texts and cartographic representations, where if you're thinking on a global scale, you're seeing lots of different cultures be represented in relationship to each other. And it is surprisingly not binary a lot of the time. There is a lot of binary, Western, Eastern, white, black, and so forth, but there's a lot that is not. So this is also really helpful for me to think about the thinking I've been doing in relationship to that other project, for this project. I had been more thinking of my intervention as talking to people who are working in critical race studies who are working on Blackness.
Okay, great question, great answer. Sean?
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful talk, Valerie. I actually I want to continue on the idea of, especially with Sandy's implication with empire, thinking about Ovid's text as a moment in the early empire of Rome, and why looking back maybe at that text as, I mean, a legitimation of empire, a legitimation of drawing up that binary into these questions. So I wonder if you could comment more on that in the sort of nature of selecting that text.
Yeah. So I'm not a classicist at all. I don't even read Latin, full disclosure. So my interest in Ovid is very much within the early modern context. And I've learned a lot more about the use of Ovid in the medieval context because of my collaboration with Peggy. There's no question but that Ovid, though, is used to legitimate empire in the early modern period. A lot of work actually has been done, much of the work on Ovid, in fact, that isn't related to gender and sexuality, is about English nationhood, English empire. That is where many critics, especially in the 1980s and 90s, were thinking about Ovid. So yes, there's definitely a kind of imperii translati, going back to Ovid for that. Although I would also say it's an alternative to the Virgilian mode of empire building. And Ovid himself had a kind of funky relationship to the empire because he was exiled by it. And he wrote the Metamorphoses while in exile. So I'm not sure what else to say about that, except that he has been used to legitimate empire for sure. And he has been read in those terms. But did you feel like, in terms of what I'm trying to do with race and or gender and sexuality, that there's a way that thinking more deeply about Ovid's own, the fact of him being part of the Roman Empire and the fact of him being exiled from it, has any particular germane pertinence?
The thing I was thinking about with it is in fact that usage, because I agree with you in the sense that Ovid has an ambiguous position in the Roman Empire itself, but the idea that the English are looking back to this great figure of empire in the Roman Empire, thinking about through that Virgilian epic as well, their place as a newly nascent empire, I think is more where I was trying to figure, because Ovid's positionality is being picked up, but I think in a way that kind of early moderns would disregard the fact of Ovid's own exile in some ways and just use him as a representative of this is a great culture and we're building on that. Mm-hmm. And then picking up those discourses of race and Ovid as such. That was. I
see. And in fact, the early moderns uptake of Ovid is very selective, and as is the medieval uptake of Ovid. So okay, thank you. Patty, you have your hand up.
Well, I do. I'm a little bit. My brain is going around and around. I'm thinking of. Okay. I haven't read many instances of Black wooing, or that kind of encounter that you're talking about. But if we take three characters, Titus Andronicus, oh God, I've lost my last one. Well, there's a ballad that I've been studying for 20 years, called, which I call The Lady in the Blackamoor. Nobody has a name, and the servant is black, but he's also a Moor. And what's the other one? There's in any case, at least in those two instances, and the third that has escaped me, they show no remorse for what they do, and they blushing is not an issue, right? So they are at one level they kind of refuse to show emotion other than anger or retribution. And yet there is, Orinoco was the other one I was thinking of. And there you do have a love relationship, but it's never described way as I remember it, the lover relationships or the encounters that you describe. And yet, so I take that and it's sort of all on the surface, you might say, but then there's this concept of exoticism that's related to the East and includes blacks. And that implies mystery. So one could argue that the refusal to display, which is not true, of course, as you say, blacks do blush. But this portrayal of the refusal to display subtle and conflicted emotions, combined with the concept of exoticism, could be interpreted as more complexity of self-reflexivity than the white nations, which are transparent. When they blush, all their emotions sort of come out, and which is true today. You know, you can't control the blush, and so I'm just sort of turning your argument on its head. But I don't know. I was just wondering how you would handle that concept that there's a kind of hiddenness in not blushing, whereas which reflects a kind of complex self rather than non-reflexivity.
Yeah, I mean, the hiddenness involved in not blushing is precisely what Aaron articulates. And I think the logical link that you're making via exoticism is that hiddenness is complexity.
Yeah.
And that may be true, but so too the transparency of the blush, I've been trying to argue, is complexity in that it always solicits an interpretation. And the interpretation, I mean, if you just think about the drama, for instance, almost always in early modern drama, when people interpret women's blushes, they get it wrong. If they interpret it as a sign of whoredom, when it's really a sign of chastity or vice versa. And this is what I was trying to allude to at the beginning. So where I would depart from what you're saying, Patty, is that I don't think the transparency is correlative with a kind of straightforward acquisition or access to knowledge. So I think
Well, I
we're
guess I didn't mean that really. I meant that it's a transparency of, even if it's of conflicted emotions or different, it's showing something.
it's showing
It's showing something that's other than what's happening, or equivalent to what's happening, but it's it can be extremely complicated in what it's showing,
right,
but it's uncontrollably exposed.
right, right. I think the lack of volition is a critical point because what Aaron is saying is that, you know, Moors, blacks can control what they put out there into the world.
Yeah, and Orinoco is.
And I think that we could think about how this links up with Stoicism and other kinds of virtues of you know, a kind of armored self that doesn't give anything away. So, you know, I do take that point. So, but in the realm of sexuality, I'm not sure I would want to say that the white attribution of exoticism onto those with darker skins is kind of the way to go. It's that seems problematic to me. That there might be, you know, mystery and complexity in that attribution of Patty just disappeared, so I got got way late. But that attribution of hiddenness. So, Jim.
Sorry, let me unmute. What a wonderful paper. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I have a question on a slightly different tack, which is, you know, at the very beginning, you mentioned a project you're working on about the utility of ambivalence in negotiating political issues. And I just loved the sort of ways in which you articulated this complex and nuanced, sophisticated and temporally weird ambivalence at the heart of the blush, right? Then at the end of the paper, that ambivalence becomes, you know, something that can be claimed for white identity, right? And so it becomes this kind of power move. And so, you know, when you first talked about the utility of ambivalence, I was thinking of this from the perspective of the critic. But then, you know, what I saw in the paper was this kind of really fascinating historical argument about the utility of ambivalence in this kind of identity formation. And I guess I want to go back to, you know, where, you know, in terms of, is there a way in which the ambivalence that you've described can be useful to us? Or is it the case that, you know, what you're offering us is this kind of wonderful articulation of the, you know, how it has been deployed in these ways in a kind of, you know, politicized, racialized power structure?
Right. That's a great question. Thanks for asking it. I hadn't thought about those two moves in quite those terms, but you're right. So the Ambivalence Project that I thought up and asked some people to work with me on, which is a 2-year project with graduate students and faculty and a staff member here, is really interdisciplinary, and it has a psychologist, it has a medical practitioner who performs abortions, has other literary critics, historians, and so forth. And what we're really trying to explore, I mean, ambivalence, if you look it up, you get a couple of different definitions, and it can be having conflicting or opposed feelings, or not knowing what you feel, right? And what we are trying to explore is the extent to which ambivalence could be reframed as a positive capacity. And in particular, be a positive capacity for political discourse. And abortion is probably the best one. I mean, it's on many of our minds right now because of what's happening at the Supreme Court. But the polarization around abortion in this country is very extreme, and has been for a very long time. But for people who are, for instance, abortion providers, they have a much more nuanced sense of what they're doing than is made available in contemporary political discourse. So for instance, one of the women, the MD on our team, recognizes that when she performs an abortion, she is ending a life. And she is accepting of that fact, which part of the discourse on the left, or a feminist discourse of abortion, makes it very difficult for people to be able to say, yeah, this is what I'm doing. And so her ambivalence about, her job essentially is for her part of her feminism. And it's the ability to hold different aspects of identity, different aspects of political discourse, and different feelings in tension, and to stay with the holding of it. And I think that there's a way in which some of the discourses around intersectionality as a feminist practice of women of color also veers towards the need to be able to hold contradictory aspects of one's identity together. So that's part of, so in thinking about ambivalence as a capacity rather than a demerit or a limitation, we're trying to think about whether it could be useful for social change. So we're actually trying to devise a toolkit that advocates of various kinds of progressive causes could use to explore ambivalence. And we're using literary texts in that toolkit. For instance, Alison Bechdel's graphic novel, Are You My Mother, is all about ambivalence. And, we're thinking of using a frame of that. And there's a wonderful poem by Gwendolyn Brooks called The Mother, which begins, abortions won't allow you to forget, and has been appropriated by the pro-life movement, but which is a profoundly ambivalent poem. So that's on one side. And then we're starting to think about, well, who gets to be ambivalent? In which contexts, and in which communities? Is it okay? Or is it a privilege? Is ambivalence a privilege? I guess is what I would answer back to you. And we're beginning to explore that ambivalence can be used in lots of different ways. I mean, it's like anything, or at least I would say, it's like anything. It's neither good nor bad, but thinking makes it so, and doing makes it so. And
Can I ask, isn't it part of the problem that ambivalence is often perceived as contradiction?
Yes. Yeah.
So if a doctor who performs abortion says, I know I'm ending a life, people say, aha, they are contradicting their position. And that's sort of what the blush does. Or can do.
Well, I am a big fan of contradiction. I really am. And I mean, I think that we all live contradictory lives all the time. It's part of a kind of, I think queer people really feel that a lot, quite frankly. And I think people of color often feel that. And I think that we need to start claiming contradiction as an attribute of our lives that we negotiate and deal with and need to work with. But yes, Patty, in the mainstream discourse, contradiction is all bad, and it makes you open and vulnerable to attack. Yeah.
And I would say that women are more associated with it. It's seen more as a female than a male trait. Women don't know their minds.
Yeah. That aspect of it, of not knowing something, of not being able to figure it out, I think that is deeply gendered. But I think the capacity to hold two ideas or feelings or identities in tension is not necessarily a gendered thing at all.
The floor is still open.
I'd love to hear from students. No question is too naive.
Well, let's see, who do we have here that I can call on?
No, Patty, you're not the teacher here.
Although I do have a medievalist, Jessica, that and she just popped up and admitted she's here. So, and you did. I would love to hear a medievalist vision of what you just presented to us. If you have one, but you don't have to speak. This is not force, but
yeah, I mean, so I'm still kind of processing my own thoughts on this because this, yeah, thank you so much. This was really lovely and wonderful. And I actually, yeah, did tune in to a little bit too of the depositions or whatever, the Supreme Court kind of hearings that were broadcast yesterday. And it really caught my eye how feeling was this hinge of where life was being or humanity and death and life kind of being formed around, and the capacity for the blush as this moment of recognition, but also where a feeling becomes, or where an emotion becomes a feeling and a feeling becomes a thought. And I really did, yeah. And I haven't actually read that. I don't think I've read the bit of Dinshaw that you had cited. So I want to go back and read more of Dinshaw in regards to that. But I really did like the idea of thinking about the trajectory of Ovid as part of this epistemology of how gender is being shaped in this process. And so I don't know, I'm still kind of working out my thoughts on this. Is like my own dissertation is thinking about gender and cognition and feeling in that process, and how gender is so interlinked with how with cognition, yet we somehow still separate that, and that is part of a long tradition of that kind of Descartes model, but also a model that doesn't acknowledge its genderedness in a similar way to how whiteness is not acknowledging its whiteness. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's my just kind of thoughts, but not a formulated question, sorry.
No, thank you. I love the phrase that you use, when feeling becomes a thought, because I think that's exactly what I'm trying to kind of get at. It's very hard to find the words to talk about these very transitory, on the verge of, not quite, because we think so linear. I mean, we're trained to think in very linear fashion. So I don't know if other languages have more words than English does for this, but being on the cusp of something and not knowing what that is, I think is really important. And I mean, and I agree that the Supreme Court discourses are in part trying to nail down, you know, when something is something definitively, right? And that's kind of scary. It's kind of scary. If you're interested in more about medieval Ovid and gender and sexuality, I just want to recommend that in the Ovidian Transversions book, there's a wonderful essay by Peggy, but also Karma Lockery, and somebody else whose name I'm now blanking on, Miranda Griffin, who are all medievalists, who wrote wonderful, wonderful essays on the Iphis and Ianthe story. So I'd be curious to hear from any of you grad students. I'm not assuming you're all early modernists necessarily or medievalists, but have you had any exposure to Ovid at all? And what has that been like? Olivia?
Yeah, I actually was exposed to Ovid in undergrad, and it was in a class where we were talking about the subject was persons and things. And so we looked at a range of, literature from, forever ago and like very, very contemporary. And we kind of just discussed how, people defined persons in literature. And so, we talked about the statue and coming to life, and that was my first exposure to Ovid. So.
Yeah. Yeah. The metamorphoses are really all over the place in terms of what they do with people, things, bodies, animals. And I had never really delved into it until I got interested in the Iphis and Ianthe story, which is a story of, not a well-known story, but a story where two young girls fall in love, one of whom has been dressed as a boy since birth. And the mother of the child who's been cross-dressed since birth is the one who arranged it, prays for her to be able to marry this girl, and she has she's promised a sex change, and she has a sex change miraculously as she's walking towards the temple. And it became a kind of major reference point for early modern thinking about female desire. So my way into Ovid was, through queer studies. And I think some people are making their way to Ovid now through animal studies, because so many times people are changed into animals, or they have sex with animals.
Or things.
Yes.
Are natural things.
Or
they're
natural.
alive, but they're not human.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that's my experience with Ovid, and like Daphne.
Becomes a tree.
Becomes a tree, yeah.
Yeah.
I know you, Sean?
Yeah, sorry to interject with this.
go ahead.
I wanted to, I've studied Latin in high school and college, but I remember reading sections about it there, but the most impactful and the most, I think, a moment where I got the sticking point, I had to translate his Heroides, which is the story of, which is a bunch of dialogues and letters from female characters from mythology to mostly the male figures who have wronged them.
Yeah.
And I found that a profoundly interesting way, and sort of tracing the genealogy that I came through within studies and feminist studies in that way. And I think it's really interesting. I'd be interested to see also if that text gets picked up in early modern literature. I don't actually know.
Yeah, actually, there is a fantastic book by Lynn Enterline called Shakespeare's Schoolroom,
Right.
which begins with the fact that, conceptually, it begins with the fact that boys who went to grammar school in the early modern period memorized these speeches from the Heroides, just as you had to translate them, they also had to translate them and memorize them. And she argues that this is part of what led to Shakespeare in particular being such a great impersonator or ventriloquist of female emotion. And it's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. It's very historically dense around around schoolroom practices, including beatings and all sorts of things. Um, but it puts Ovid, and particularly that text, right at the center of the English Renaissance. And the other thing I will just say, and then Bernadette, you can jump in, is that I didn't mention this in my talk, but in the late 16th century, in the 1580s and the 1590s, there was a vogue for Ovid. And so a lot of the plays and even many of the poems that are most well known in the early modern period are influenced by Ovid's tales. They may not be what we're calling transversions, that is, new versions that are either translations or that repurpose Ovid in the way that Beaumont's tale does. Nobody would ever call that a translation. It's just way too big and baggy and explicit, and has too many other things going on. So we coined this term transversion to kind of get at what we feel is happening with Ovid in the early modern period. Yeah, so I'll just stop there. So Bernadette.
Actually, you just answered my question because I was going to ask about the relationship between transversion and translation, particularly as I understand the exposure and of particularly the Renaissance English schoolboy, and maybe more broadly Renaissance schooling to Ovid was through memorization, but it was through this practice of double translation. So translating out of Latin and then having to translate back from the source vernacular into Latin. But yeah, you could address it further if you wish, but I think you answered. So why you actually were thinking in a more complex way about transversion and what that does in terms of language, literature, gender, sexuality, race.
Yeah, exactly. Patty.
I don't want to dominate, but I have been thinking about in modern times, it's always women get this often when they're giving a speech or nervous or well, that's usually how it's interpreted. They get a rash right here, a Rosetta rash, and it's not a blush, but it's sort of, I always feel sorry for them because it's saying outwardly, I am nervous. But what it's not saying is what that person is doing, which is conquering the nervousness in a way, because they're right there in front of everybody, giving the news or a speech. But it's more, it's not sexual, but it is similar and it's problematic. And I've never heard it mentioned in the Renaissance, but it's very common. I guess I notice it among academic women more often because they're put in the position of having to be in the public eye.
Well, it's interesting there. I did look at several social science studies of the phenomena of flushing, blushing. I mean, these are all related, kinds of things. And in fact, both I mean, within conventional social science, just in the US, there's a lot of different etiologies proposed for both the warmth and the redness that can occur involuntarily,
And
and then cross-culturally as well, in terms of what the potential meanings are of these things. They do vary quite a lot. But Elizabeth, you have a hand up.
You have to unmute, E. You have to unmute.
Got it. Okay, sorry. It's two screens are too many. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on whether the 18th century play with the purer blush that Belinda gets, the Belinda fakes, or that, by the end of the century, there's this notion that that a woman can create, this is in Erasmus Darwin's writing on women's education, that women have to cultivate a second nature so that they will blush. How can you help me think about the kind of, is there a disconnection from the project of racializing sexuality there, or is this a kind of, how might you play with that extension into the 18th century and the fantasy of a second nature, which could take you in the direction of the criminal, or could take you in the the feminine criminal, or the feminine fall, or in the other direction, or in a different direction. So love to hear what you think about that. In other words, is this project over, and therefore the effect is available for other kinds of codes of meaning? The project of racializing sexuality is over, and therefore we've embarked on something new. Or how would you address that?
Yeah, I wouldn't put it in those terms, because I think what you're describing is also happening in the early modern period.
Okay.
I think that it's less theorized for sure. But I was in the very opening remarks about the kind of misogynist topos of women seeming and being,
Yeah.
and the split between those things.
Yeah.
It's always veering into that women could act, right? Women,
Okay.
and women can paint. The way it gets articulated in the Renaissance is women paint their faces.
Right.
And there's a huge anti-cosmetic discourse in the period
Yeah.
that people have written a lot about. So
Yeah.
that's where I would say that is mostly located, more than that they have to develop some kind of cognitive ability to fake a
Yeah.
blush, like a fake orgasm kind of,
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
I think that there's more performative anxiety going on later
Okay.
on. And I think that that's actually probably related to pornography, because if you think about Cleland and Fanny Hill, this kind of stuff is going on all the time. Like, having to perform pleasure,
Yeah.
for others. Whereas in the Renaissance, it's more a fear that women are doing that, that they
Yeah.
might be able to do that. So, and I don't think that the project is over by any means in the 18th century. I think that this continues. I think that the blush continues to be a racialized phenomenon. I think that, that we still inherit it today. And, I didn't know what I would find when I read an article that was written that is called "Does Complexion Color Affect the Experience of Blushing?" I actually didn't know what the social scientists who had interviewed tons of people about their own experience of blushing would say. And what they found was that across races, there was no difference, at least in their study, in ease, frequency, latency, and duration of blushing. What the difference was in how individuals described their blushing experience as depending on visible signs or not. So this goes back a little bit to what Patty was talking about, that people experience blushing whether other people see it or not. They self report, I guess would be the word, that they would use in these studies. So, but the fact that, I was like, well, how do different races perceive this thing. I think it's that I'm the heir to precisely this discourse, in other words.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So it seems like people need to start heading out. So I just want to thank you all for your attention and your interest. And
Well, I want to thank you for a wonderful talk, and on such short notice too. I didn't, well, this is the world we live in. It's topsy-turvy. But it's great to hear about a new project. And I remember you writing to me and saying, I've got a talk. I said, do you have something in the bag? You said, I've got something that I've given so many times. I'm so sick of it. I don't want to give it anymore. And but I have something brand new that I'm working on. And that's exciting because we get a glimpse at a new frontier that's being opened up. And I thank you for that. I think we all do. And so much appreciate your taking the time to present your new work for us.
well, it was really a pleasure and exciting for me to share it with you and to receive your feedback, which I will take to heart. So it comes at a really good time for me.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think my internet cut out oddly enough twice. So we'll see what the video looks like.
I've got a recording and we're going to post it on the EMC for anybody who wants to come
Good
back
for you,
or anything. So thank you to
and
everyone
we'll
for
put
coming.
that beginning part. Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks again,
Jessica. Sorry
Nicole.
for calling on you.
No. It was good. My wheels were spinning, so it was good.
My wheels were spinning too, and I'm in all sorts of different directions. So it's that's good. That means you're on to something,
I
Valerie.
hope so.
And